Thanks for coming, everybody. As Mikal said, I'm Ben Vilhauer, the chair of the City College Philosophy Department, and it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Lou Marinoff. Lou is professor of philosophy and Asian studies here at CCNY. He has written over 60 scholarly articles and 10 books, including his new book that we'll be hearing about tonight, On Human Conflict, The Philosophical Foundations of War and Peace, as well as Plato Not Prozac, which has been translated into 27 languages, The Power of Tao, Therapy for the Sane, The Middle Way, and many other titles as well. Lou is the founding president of the American Philosophical Practitioners Association and was also chair of the City College Philosophy Department for many years before I took the job. He helped me transition into the job just before CUNY's current financial crisis arrived, which may suggest that his intellectual powers extend to precognition. In all seriousness, though, it has been an honor to serve in the department that Lou helped build. Please join me in welcoming Lou Marinoff.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. And this is a very special occasion for me, and thank you so much for coming. My son Julian is in attendance. He's been to all my book launches in New York. 7 of my books have been launched here. And thanks, Julian, for being so stalwart. My cousin Sonia is in from London, so I'm almost now surrounded by family members. And my dear colleague David is here from the department, and who read this book some years ago and actually liked an early draft. I'm going to tell you 2 backstories about this book before I actually run through a sort of skeletal summary. It's a large work, both in time and in volume. And I'm going to give you, therefore, the early backstory and the late backstory to help contextualize. And then I will endeavor to summarize in just under an hour 35 years cumulative research and reflection on this very expansive topic of human conflict, okay? So that'll be the real challenge for me, to give you a kind of an intelligible outline of what the book contains. There's a lot of meat on its bones, and I will not be able to delve very deeply into that, but at least perhaps give you a sense of what it contains and disclose some of the, what I would like to call revelations that occurred to me during the course of the writing and reflection. This, the first backstory is as follows. Its original draft was 1987, done over a 3-year period and submitted as a PhD at the University of London. My viva voce, the oral exam, was very peculiar. Most of my peers in graduate school had sailed through their vivas, and they said to me, "Don't worry, the examiners will just invite you in and sit you down and say it's okay. We're giving you, it passed. We just want to talk to you and maybe help you make some small revisions." And that's the sort of expected thing. It's not a committee in London, though. It's a star chamber. There are 2 examiners, an external and an internal, and the internal defers to the external, and your supervisor may be present but may not speak unless spoken to. So it's more of a somber occasion and a bit of an intimidating one. So I walked in, having submitted an early version of this, and there was a very stony silence in the room. It was already not good. When I sat down, the external looked at me, and the first words out of his mouth were, and I quote, "What are we going to do with you?" this is not the way you want to begin your Viva Voce. They went on, with I think, downhill from there, pretty much. They ended up actually referring it. That is, they could have passed it or failed it or referred it. They referred it, which meant they wanted me to do a different thesis. They wanted me to take a little chunk of this and drill down until I reached some sort of rock bottom, and they gave me time to do it. That was all in the protocols. The internal said to me, basically, this would be a great book, he said, but we're not going to give you a PhD for it. So I like doing things the hard way, some of you who know me well. Okay, so I then went away and I wrote something that they wanted and also that I wanted. It was perfectly fine, just a different kind of work. And it ended up being accepted for a doctorate. So I feel that I got 2 for the price of 1, in essence, okay? A great learning experience. That was the first backstory. The second backstory is much more recent, and it's all Lydia's fault. Lydia, thank you for being here, my colleague of 25 years as a practitioner and a philosopher, and a great one she is. I sat on a panel of hers at the Pacific APA a couple of years ago, and acquisition editors scour the program looking for people, and they approached me and said, do you have anything? And I said, yeah, I have 1 or 2 things. We met. I discussed this. They said, this is interesting. Send us a couple of chapters and a table of contents. I did. They read them. They said, we want to publish this. And I said, fine. I sent them the whole manuscript. They came back to me with a contract, but they said, we need you to update it because it was really last updated in 1989. The world has moved on slightly. Fortunately for the manuscript and unfortunately for the world, conflict is still everywhere, so I didn't have to change any of the core arguments, but I had to do a considerable amount of research to update them, and I did, and attempted as seamlessly as possible to weave the last 30 years of conflict-related events and their potential resolutions into the book, fairly seamlessly. And that was where matters stood until last year when I got another email from them having updated it. They then sent an email saying, Dear Professor Marinoff, we are very uncomfortable by some of your, we are made very uncomfortable by some of your views. During the last 30 years, things have happened, and I updated the book, and that made them uncomfortable. And I replied, well, you know me well enough, some of you. When they said they were uncomfortable, I really said, firstly, I do not conceive that it's a philosopher's job to make anybody comfortable. In the first place. And secondly, I've been made very uncomfortable. I was made uncomfortable witnessing 9/11, for example. I was made very uncomfortable by a number of other things that go on. Structural violence and actual violence make me very uncomfortable. And if you are made uncomfortable by my words, it's because they somehow cut across the grain of your political indoctrination and little else. And that's part of the problem from where I sit. So they then were even more uncomfortable. But they offered me 3 options. Either they said, we can release you from the contract, or we can send the book out to some friends of ours who will edit it in such a way as to make us comfortable. Or, to my astonishment, they said we can move it over from Lexington Books to Hamilton Books, which is, Rowman and Littlefield's a big house, and they have many imprimaturs. Their main philosophy imprimatur is Lexington, and that was the original contract. I agreed to this. I thought this was great. Publishers are wonderful because at the end of the day, they're soulless, okay, even if they're uncomfortable. They still want to sell books. So they were hedging their bet, right? They could move it far enough away from their comfort zone to alleviate themselves of the burden of having their imprimatur on it, but at the same time, it would be good for the house, just in case some people aren't uncomfortable reading it. And I said, this is a great accommodation, and we could solve many of the world's conflicts using this model. Okay? So I'm glad to have made you uncomfortable. At the end of the day, it's worked out well. Yeah, so we have the book. Those are the 2 backstories, all right? Now that I apparently have your attention, I'll try to keep it for a minute, if I can get PowerPoint to work. Let's see. Rifkind. And thank you, Mikhail. I have been neglectful. I should have and now will. Thank you so much for having invited me. It's really a pleasure to be here. We've known each other also 25 years, and it's great to have this chance to collaborate with you, and thank you for doing such a great job with the center and for allowing this event to take place, and to your able staff, Sophie, I've seen here, for the setup and all. Thank you so much. Okay, the table of contents, it contains, now you probably want to see the show, slideshow. from Stark. Yes, here we go. There's an epistle to the reader from Grounds Zero. I was a schoolboy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I have very, very stark memories of expecting at any moment the world to blow up. I mean, you remember, some of you, the duck and cover stuff? You know, that would have done little, I'm afraid, against the 100 megaton airburst. So this was, my question was why? How did we get here? I mean, I was 11 years old, and it was quite potentially the end of our civilization. And so I asked why, and nobody answered. We just went on with the curriculum. Algebra, geometry, Latin, whatever. It was good, but nobody answered the question. And they said, we have someone in the office monitoring the radio, and the headmaster said, if anything happens, we'll send you all home. And I said to myself, well, if anything happens, I won't get home, in time. But in any case, that was the first question. Why did we get to this point, and how? Then, some years later, having witnessed 9/11, which has been renamed Ground Zero down there, that was quite a. We all have our memories of where were we. Yes, most of you know that people of the previous generation remember where they were when Pearl Harbor was attacked. That was a signal moment in American and world history. Most of us in this room who were alive at the time remembered exactly where we were when Kennedy was assassinated. That was another one of those turning points of history. And I think everyone has a 9/11 memory. Where were you when, and how did you find out about it? So let's just delve into the problem of war, an overview. So just to give you an essence of the severity of this problem, war is defined by me in this book as I borrowed the term from Anatole Rappaport, as a special case of organized group violence. All right, so nature is full of organized group violence, but war is a special case of it. From 3600 BC to 1974, there have been of the order of 14,500 wars. Right? That's a huge number, with an estimated 1 billion battle deaths and 2.5 billion deaths from war-related famine. This is exclusive of civil wars and other internal state conflicts. So the impact on humanity is, on this measure, enormous, simply enormous and unbelievable. Omar Bradley, the American general, said in 1948 that ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants, and indeed it remains so. Contemporary soldiers, now war has changed considerably since the end of the Cold War. Contemporary soldiers are computer hackers, financiers, drug smugglers, agents of private corporations, according to two Chinese generals. And contemporary conflicts are also asymmetric. It's not the old sport of kings anymore. Terrorism is asymmetric, computer hacking is asymmetric, and drones are asymmetric. There are all sorts of ways now of waging wars which have really morphed from the more conventional. I am an optimist, however, but my optimism is heavily guarded because of something called the fallacy of naive optimism. Let me just read you a couple of quotations to illustrate that fallacy. Some very brilliant physicists and others, scientists, have expressed this fallacy. Pasteur said in 1988, "We may be sure that science, in obeying the law of humanity, will always labor to enlarge the frontiers of life." Here's another one from Nobel himself to Baroness von Suder in 1892. He said, "Perhaps my factories," his dynamite factories, yes, "perhaps my factories will put an end to war even sooner than your Congress. On the day that two army corps can mutually annihilate each other in a second, all civilized nations will surely recoil with horror and disband their troops." Not quite. So this fallacy continued to be rehearsed by atomic physicists. For example, Moon and Burhoff, Millikan, Nobel laureate, "There is no likelihood man can ever tap the power of the atom," he said in 1923, a Nobel laureate in physics. Rutherford, another one, 10 years later said, "The energy produced by the breaking down of the atom is a very poor kind of thing. Anyone who looks for a source of power in the transformation of the atom is talking moonshine." This went on, and it still goes on today. So that fallacy is unfortunately well entrenched. I'm not that kind of optimist. I'm a different kind of optimist. There have been 4 historical, largely discernible phases of warfare. You can arbitrarily cut that many ways, but you could define historically a phase from Alexander to Napoleon, because an argument has been made by many military historians, that no one could have withstood Alexander's hoplite phalanx until artillery. After artillery, everything changed, and Napoleon was this great adventurer conqueror who mobilized the resources of the entire nation state. So the Napoleonic era was the introduction of both the concept of the modern nation state and total war, as we now know it. Napoleon to Hitler is that era. Adventurer conquerors mobilizing the entire resources of nation states and conquered nation states. That ended with the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. You had the emergence of the two superpowers and the atomic age. That was the third phase. 1989, the Cold War ended. And from the end of the Cold War to the present, I argue, we are in fact well embarked on World War III. And that's a different kind of war. And that's a two-front war. There is, like it or not, a civilizational conflict between Islam and the West. And it's not organized by any one person. It's an emergent set of forces which occupied the power vacuum in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. An entire flank opened up along the whole of that segment, and into that breach have stepped a number of various kinds of jihadists. And they have resumed something that's much more long-standing in their historical record. Many Westerners don't recall the golden age of the caliphs or the Reconquista of Spain or these other events, but they do. And the other problem of that war is that it's a two-front war. There's a civil war going on within every Western and Westernized nation. And we have here a prime example of political paralysis, economic injustices. Along any axis that you want to look, you will see polarizations going on and a lack of ability to establish and follow a moral compass for the common good. There's been a civil war being waged, cultural civil war in the U.S., to my memory, since the 60s. It's probably older than that. But it's reaching now more apocalyptic proportions, unfortunately. And the alliances of the hard left are precisely with the theocrats, the Islamic theocrats. There are plenty and millions of peace-loving Muslims in the world, and we have lots of them at City College. And they're very happy to learn from us and to coexist with us and all of that. But unfortunately, their leadership is not of the same ilk. So we have this war going on. Hi, Merle, please be welcome. Hi, Vonna. And this is World War III, and I've described it at length in the book. Now, look at the costs. The costs of war are staggering. And I'm not trying to minimize the human tragedy. I'm just trying to emphasize the waste, the absolute waste of it. Here is a report. Aldous Huxley quotes a report by Nicholas Murray Butler, an American Nobel laureate, a peace laureate from 1934. And Nicholas Murray Butler, in his report to the Carnegie Foundation, said that the cost of the Great War was reckoned, that's World War I, yes, reckoned at about $400,000 million or 80,000 million pounds at the time. And this sum, he says, would have sufficed to provide every family in America, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, Ireland, France, Belgium, and Germany, and Russia with a 500-pound house, 200 pounds worth of furniture, and 100 pounds worth of land. Then, beyond that, every town of 20,000 inhabitants and over in all the above-mentioned countries could have been presented with a library to the value of £1 million and a university to the value of $2 million. After which, it would have been possible to buy the whole of France and Belgium. That is all the land, houses, factories, railways, churches, roads, harbors, etc. in these countries. So that will give you some example of how the monetary expenditure of World War I could have been translated into cultural endeavors. It's staggering, is it not? And of course, the cost of World War I was dwarfed by World War II, and the Vietnam War, and the Korean War, and the Cold War, and all the other wars that have and are being fought. As to why anyone would want to buy France and Belgium, I'm not clear. We have enough problems as it is, but anyway, I'll leave that to you. All right, this is a graphic illustrating what is Steven Pinker and others have called the long peace. This shows that since 1946 to the present day, up to 2016 in any case, there are 4 tiers, yes? 4 tiers. The bottom represents international or colonial or imperial conflicts. Yeah, they've diminished because the Cold War superseded the war of the superpowers, and the proxy wars fought by the superpowers superseded the colonial and imperial conflicts. So they've abated. On the other hand, conflicts between states have also slightly diminished, but they still exist, yes? But look at the vast increase in civil conflicts at the same time. As the world became more decentralized, more and more civil conflicts erupted, and everyone was happy to sell weapons, okay? It's big business. During the Iran-Iraq War, you may remember that, a World War I style trench war that went on for 8 years and took about 3 million lives. No fewer than 26 nations sold weapons to both sides, including Canada, including all the peace-loving peoples who put on such a happy face. All right, they made good money on death. It's really awful, but true. And on top of this, what we find are civil conflicts with foreign state intervention. So this has crept back into the picture. It's not the intervention of imperialism or colonialism, but it's the intervention of other kinds of proxy politics, all right? They call this the long peace. I rather tend to believe it's the long misnomer. And of course, international arms sales have not abated much. There was a slight fall off just after the Cold War, but it's picking up again. Just like my advisors tell me, mutual funds, they always get bigger in the long run. So we have this picture. That doesn't make for a more peaceful world. Yeah, these arms are being sold for a purpose. What about peace? Well, peace is defined obversely in this work. If war is organized group violence, peace is spontaneous individual beneficence. And we can distinguish, of course, negative versus positive peace. That's Johann Galtung, the great pioneer of peace studies. Negative peace is merely an absence of overt conflict, but it could be, indeed, a presence of hostility or an intent, hostile intent. Positive peace, rather, is active cooperation. Yes? That's the distinction. And similarly, Daisaku Ikeda draws the same distinction, although he calls them passive versus active peace. And it's active peace that makes the world a better place. Passive peace can be viewed as merely a lull between battles. And Hobbes made that point, anticipating both of them in chapter 3 of Leviathan. So how do we get to peace? Well, you have to wait till chapter 7 and 8. Okay, you have to wade through, or just skip to them. But the analysis of conflict takes up most of the book, and then we get to peace. Chapter 2, I'm going to bypass very quickly, just in case some of you have math neurosis. I don't want to bother you with it. But I have a purpose in looking at the mathematics of conflict, and that purpose is simply to see whether and to what extent we can describe wars as discrete events in a manner analogous to the ways in which we describe complex yet discrete events in nature. Yeah, we describe births or deaths of stars, eruption of volcanoes, formation of hurricanes. We can model all these things mathematically and fairly well as natural phenomena. Of course, the meaning of an event is not at all transparent. Bertrand Russell wrote a very famous article about this, disparaging the notion that there really were events. And how an event is defined is not trivial. If 9/11 was one event, the insurance payout for the World Trade Center was $3.5 billion. If it was 2 events, it's $7 billion. So a lot rides on how lawyers and the legal system will interpret the word event. Yeah, and believe me, they've debated this with $3.5 billion riding on the balance of their decision. So I mean, events are not trivial things. But it turns out that the 3 main methods of mathematical modeling show, and chapter 2 shows, that wars and outcomes of battles are not predictable deterministically, so differential equations don't help us. Wars are not distributed randomly in space or time. You can cherry pick so as to get matches with Poisson curves, but actually if you choose enough data, you'll discover that they're not random events. And games theory, which is the 3rd main branch applicable, cannot be prescriptive of rational or irrational behavior in situations of risk or conflict of interest, primarily because it lacks a metric of axiology. So the long story short is that wars are not amenable to mathematical treatments as discrete events. This raises the question, therefore, of whether they are better described as continuous. If they're not discrete, then I'm taking a physicist for a second. If it's not discrete, it must be continuous, and then you turn to Thomas Hobbes for, I think, the best account of the continuity of conflict over time. And I'll go a little bit, but not more deeply, into Leviathan for this. Hobbes' analysis of human nature reveals we are drawn into conflicts by egoistic, myopic, and rapacious self-interest, primarily. Hobbes anticipated Darwin's more general struggle for existence by 2 centuries, and anticipated Freud's psychological view by almost 3 centuries, Hobbes is a wealth of great psychology, as well as an understanding of the struggles for life and for prosperity as well. His main thesis is that we are naturally driven by an interminable succession of desires and aversions, which, in his words, ceaseth only in death, and that absent a power to keep us all in awe, we persist in a war of all against all. That's the Hobbesian state of nature, yes? This is all well tricked out by him. We can extricate ourselves from our state of nature and into a commonwealth only by voluntarily limiting our liberties, entering into binding social contracts, and transferring power to sovereign authorities. Hobbes hedges his bet here. Sovereign authority meaning either one person or a body of people who both protect us and dispense justice. Hobbes' prescription, if adopted, solves the problem of civil war, which was his aim. However, since sovereigns have no meta power to keep them all in awe, his solution to the problem of civil war is also a recipe for international war, because the sovereigns are in a meta state of nature with one another, and there's no power to keep them all in awe. And sovereigns don't voluntarily limit their own liberties. If they want to get reelected, they don't. So Hobbes' theory, of course, was disputed vehemently by Rousseau, who inverted it completely. He couldn't stomach Hobbes' conclusions. He understood the arguments well enough. But however, was endorsed by Kant in his tract Perpetual Peace. He professes Hobbesism from the start. He says, war is engrafted in human nature. Peace must be established. I'm quoting Kant. In light of contemporary scientific findings, and I've reviewed all this stuff in there, Pinker concludes, and Pinker's done a lot of good work in this area, and Pinker concludes that Hobbes was right and Rousseau was wrong. I'm just giving you the conclusion. You can read my arguments, you can read Pinker's arguments, okay? So where does this get us? Well, Hobbes also anticipated Galtung's negative peace and Decatur's passive peace by positing the persistence of a will to contend. And I quote, "For war consisteth not in battle only or in the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war as it is in the nature of weather. And it is this Hobbesian will to contend that constantly overrules our Pinkerian better angels." If you read that book, you'll understand. Hobbes believed, very interestingly, and I think brilliantly, that wars are caused primarily by human ignorance of their causes. The cause of war, says Hobbes, is that men know not the causes neither of war nor peace. And this is also the Buddhist view for different reasons, that a general ignorance pervades our consciousness. My students have all heard this before, and thank you for coming. That it's a general ignorance which in Vedic its terminology is avidya, and this blinds us to the nature of things, and therefore seduces us easily to becoming embroiled in conflicts which otherwise could be averted. So this, in turn, suggests that we undertake a causal analysis. Yes, that segues into Chapter 4, yeah? Now, Chapter 4 is a big chunk, so I'm just going to give you a page worth of again, I'm giving you the skeletal outline. The etiology of conflict. Now, etiology has two meanings. It's the philosophy of causation and also the causes of diseases. So there's a medical analogy that crops up that over the centuries people have thought war is some kind of a disease. War can be expressed as war fever. There's a lot of analogies, and I'm not going to go over them here. The whole first part of Chapter 4 deals with the medical analogy. But in general, here is the causal finding. There's an analysis of the general principle of causation in humans, and of monocausal and polycausal theories of war causation itself. That's a big story in itself. The chapter also assesses both Hindu and Buddhist theories of karma, which is, on the one hand, the conservation of moral energy, or on the other hand, causation in human affairs more generally. The salient findings can be summarized as follows. While one can find ample political pretexts, economic excuses, religious rationalizations, and psychological scenarios that present themselves as direct or indirect causes of particular wars, all of these, among other causes, appear to be sufficient but not necessary for the occurrence of war. That's my analysis. You can always give a sufficient explanation as to why a particular war occurred, but you cannot demonstrate that it was ever necessary. I sound a bit like Hume here. I didn't begin with Hume. I ended up going with him because I think he's right about that. The future does not need to resemble the past, and that could be a blessing. So the following two factors, however, do appear to be universally prevalent in humans, and these are causal factors. And the first is somewhat psychological. Unconscious infantilism, which enables self-transcending identification with groups, be they tribes, demes, athletic teams, nation-states, religions, or cognate totems. And this operates ubiquitously in the human. And it comes probably from our evolutionary psychology of needing to gather together in order to survive and thrive. So that's the human equivalent of a herd instinct. Becomes identification with a totem, transcends the individual. The individual barters his or her identity for identification, which gives back some kind of security, but then can be manipulated to be expressed violently, and that's the problem. It's a big problem. Teamed with consciously exercised volition, which can be directed either toward war or peace. So that's better hope. I depend on volition, Ben. I need volition for this. We have to be. If we have no free will at all, I'm a compatibilist. But if we have no free will, then it doesn't matter. Then I was destined to write this, and you're destined to be here. It doesn't matter what we do. But I believe we do have some constrained will, and that can be directed toward peace, and that makes a big difference. So the etiological analysis. And I want to say Buddhist philosophy in particular, and I mean secular Buddhist philosophy, not the religion, the philosophy, offers remedies against human ignorance of causality, and also offers an answer to Hobbes, because its practices show us, and actually empirically, confirmably give us ways to still our interminable succession of desires and aversions, and therefore still the inner conflicts which can be manipulated by others into expression as other and outward conflicts. The etiological analysis of this chapter mandates a bifurcation of the inquiry. One into the biological substrate of organized group violence, so the nature of conflict needs then to be more deeply explored. To what extent are we, as products of natural selection, mandated to this? And secondly, into the phenomenon of cultural evolution, which is actually very important and interesting, and its role in war and peace. And it will turn out, of course, that the two are interactive. They're yin and yang. To a certain extent, nature and nurture interact, and demarcating them is quite a task. And there are some demarcations that can be made, others are more difficult to make, and also culture can override biology in certain important ways. So I will, I guess, give some examples of that in what follows, all right? Are you still with me? All right, I'm racing through this, but yes?
You said that these reasons that can always be made for wars, that when you say a war could have happened without, that they didn't necessarily lead to war, or that war didn't need them, I guess is what
I'm suggesting that the causes that we give, that historians give, or analysts give, or anyone who studies war, when you ask how did this war take place, or why did this war take place, I'm suggesting that the explanations are always sufficient, but never necessary.
So the war could have happened anyways?
No, that it's not necessarily the case that any war has to happen.
Gotcha, thanks.
All right, but there are always some sufficient reason people find for waging it.
Sure.
But it's not ever necessary that it be waged. One could always have found a sufficient reason not to wage it. And we don't know about the ones when people find sufficient reasons not to. Well, we have one very big example. They found sufficient reason not to launch the nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We wouldn't be here talking about it, all right? So they found sufficient reason to come back from the brink of mutual assured destruction. So if they found sufficient reason for that, they could presumably find sufficient reason to back off from lesser conflicts as well, by inference, okay? I see some of you are nodding. Yeah, keep the optimism alive, but not the naive kind. So chapter 5 is the nature of conflict, and we're looking now into, to me this is the getting close to the heart. 5 and 6 are really the nature and the nurture are the really interesting parts in terms of the research and the writing and the feedback that I received. So firstly, you must understand that there is a thermodynamic basis to violence. All right, so this is a law of nature. And why is it a law of nature? It's a law of nature as follows. Life, if you ask what the heck is life, and I'm not going to give you the biblical account, I'm giving you a scientific account. Life, whatever else it is a statistically permissible but highly improbable temporary and localized violation of the second law of thermodynamics, which mandates increasing entropy as the near ubiquitous direction of time's arrow. So why are we standing here?
Good question.
Because, thank you, Merle, especially since as sentient beings, it's okay, Merle and I go back a long way. Sentient beings, especially during ontogeny and maturation, are localized manifestations of negentropy. Yes, the amount of organization it takes for the fertilized ovum to become an embryo, to become a fetus, and then at birth to continue its neurological maturation, that's all negentropic, yes? This is increased organization. And then we get to a certain point in life where, we're down the other side of the mountain, but I don't want to remind anyone, you know what I'm saying. But basically, for a long time, we are resisting entropy. Isn't this amazing? We have the ability to do that, but there's a transaction cost You can't freely resist this law. And the transaction cost is that to maintain their own negentropic states, beings must wrest order from their environments and leave a trail of disorder in their wake. Okay, that's the price. This is also called the food chain. We can't eat inanimate objects. We have to take life in order to sustain life, whether it's plant matter or more sentient beings or something in between. You cannot live on inanimate, unsentient organisms. If you're going to sustain your own negentropy, you have to take life in order to sustain life. Yeah? And so the transactions of the food chain are necessarily violent, whether it's one by many or many by one. The whalebone cetacean whale breakfast on 4 tons of krill. You know, these animals don't swim voluntarily down the whale's gullet. You know, it has to engulf them and swallow them. The anoma ants will dismember a fowl in a matter of moments. Now, the chicken doesn't pluck itself to get ready for the ants. They have to violently incapacitate it and kill it and dismember it. Yes, so the transactions of the food chain are violent, and that's in order to sustain this highly improbable negentropic thing we call life. And there's no way out of that. Eventually, we will return to the stardust from which we're made, and hopefully in a non-violent way. So, as Oswald Spengler observed, every drop of water is a battlefield, and it is if you look in a microscope. And moreover, what we've learned now that we have a lot of really good documentary nature photography and we can speed up cameras, we've discovered coral reefs are battlefields. You know that at night, the polyps come out of the corals and they wage turf wars. They wage this unbelievable. They use chemical and physical means to try to drive each other back and occupy territory. These are corals and they're engaged in battles. This is not anthropomorphic. They really are. And forest floors, if you watch speeded up video of a forest floor or a jungle floor, you'll see vegetative matter competing for sunlight and water, yes? And they have all kinds of strategies and tactics. This is not anthropomorphic, it's a battlefield also. So these are necessarily violent transactions of survival. Now, wait a minute, what about a couple of finer points? This is where it gets really relevant for us. Firstly, there's in nature an incredible and universal ability to regulate food supply for the most part. And how do they do that? Animals particularly do this well. Wynne Edwards, a Scottish neo-Darwinist, proposed a very elegant explanation. Every species, he observed, persists in unstable homeostasis in its given habitat, sure. How do animals regulate so as not to overexploit their food supply? Good question. Here, Wynne Edwards proposed an elegant and empirically confirmable explanation. They don't directly regulate their food supply. They do so by occupying a particular territory, be it a parcel of land or a volume of air or of water, that contains the food supply. Each species has an optimum number in its given habitat, that is, an ideal population density that ensures both sufficient numbers for reproduction and an ample food supply. And this is natural selection's crafting. So Wynne Edwards hypothesized, and ethologists have consistently confirmed, that decreases in population density result in increased reproduction so as to regain and sustain the optimum number, whereas increases in population density which exceed the optimum number will not be tolerated, even amidst abundant food. When the optimum number is exceeded, even if you give them enough to eat, normal social behaviors will break down and they will effect a reduction to absolute numbers by violent means until the optimum number is restored. A perfect example of this is Solly Zuckerman's classic studies of the baboons in London Zoo in the 20s, and he got it all wrong. He watched these baboons basically behaving in a completely insane way. I mean, they were killing each other, fighting over corpses. They were doing things, and he said, well, these baboons are obviously deranged animals. What he didn't realize is that although to the naked eye, to the untrained observer, they appeared to have plenty of elbow room. There were a couple of dozen baboons in an enclosure of 500 square yards. The optimum number of the baboon is much, much smaller than that. Okay, and so these baboons were experiencing a population pressure of 100,000 times their norm in the wild. When ethologists got into the wild post-World War II and began to observe baboons, they don't behave like this. Not at all. They're much less violent than chimpanzees, for example. That's if they have an optimum number. Okay? They have much better social order. So here are some typical optimum densities. I compiled this chart from various researchers. Ants, of course, manage 20 million per square mile. You won't notice them much until they interfere with your picnic, but they're there in vast numbers. Gibbon family, 40 per square mile. Baboons, here you go, 3.35 per square mile. That's, they need a lot of elbow room. They need a lot of space to forage. Gorilla troop, 1 per square mile. and wolf pack approximately 0.001. They have a territory. A wolf pack of 10 animals has a typical territory of 1,000 square miles. They get around, and they have a low optimum. We're like that. Our early human hunter-gatherers, approximately like wolf packs. Okay? Now, what do? Pre-Neolithic and hunting and gathering bands had that optimum number. Post-Neolithic settlements saw population densities grow dramatically. Contemporary microstates sustained densities of thousands per square mile, yes? Contemporary megacities, such as this one, tens of thousands per square mile. And therefore, there appears to be no biological limit to the human optimum number. And that depends only on technology. Can we feed that many people? You better hope so, because if New York City gets deprived of its food chain, it won't take long for normal social behaviors to break down. Yes, we have about 3 days. I mean, there's so many trucks coming in every day with food. If that stops, we will do what the baboons do in short order, because we're really dependent on technology to sustain such unrealistic numbers. But there is no natural limit. We can do it if we can be smart enough to figure out how to feed ourselves, right? So there are certain kinds of exemptions. And I think natural selection has omitted many things in the human case, and I'm driving to a very important point here, and I'll try and stay on point. We are not so warlike because of what's present in our nature. We are so warlike because of several economies of natural selection, and there are several absences of things in our nature. And this is what impels us so much to war, and I'll enumerate some of them. This is one. There's no optimum number. Okay? No optimum number. And the corollary of that is there is no biological limit to human acquisitiveness either. When we were hunter-gatherers, there was a technological limit on acquisitiveness because you could only carry around so much. And nomadic peoples are much more sparing for this reason. If you have to take your tent and take your cookware and take your possessions, you will be minimalistic because you know you need to schlep this stuff around, okay? But if you can afford, because of technology, to remain in one place and to become very dense population-wise, you will tend to acquire a lot of things. We all do. And so there's no limit on acquisitiveness, and that includes wealth, that includes territory, that includes Lebensraum, that includes however you want to parse it. That includes Alexander's ambition to conquer the world. There's no limit biologically to what we can acquire. That's very dangerous. Other animals have a biological limit imposed on them, and that's conducive to their preservation, yes? Okay. Next point, still in the nature of conflict. How do they regulate conspecific violence? That is, violence between members of the same species, yes? And nature has evolved very important ways of doing this. Most conspecific violence, except among humans, is non-lethal. And its purpose is invariably twofold. To establish a dominance hierarchy. In most species, that's a male dominance hierarchy, not without important exceptions, but in most species it's male, in tandem with reproductive access to females. Elephants are a great example of a female dominance hierarchy. Elephant bands are led by wise, old, grandmother elephants, and they are the dominant animal, but they drive the adolescent males out, right? That's how they manage. Because adolescent males are not manageable. So they have to drive them out. But, that's one example. The insects, social insects are all led by queens, yes? The politics are utterly totalitarian. I would not recommend this as a model, okay, for humans. But anyway, the male dominance hierarchy tends to be the rule, not the exception. All animals equipped by nature with lethal weapons are also equipped by nature with recognized gestures of appeasement or submission, so that conflicts can be terminated non-lethally. I cannot tell you how important this is. If you have a dog at home and you play with the dog rolls over, it exposes its jugular. The very thing that would get it killed sends a signal to the other dog not to do it. The fact that the dog exposes its jugular, the other dog and the wolf in the wild says, oh, okay, and doesn't tear its throat out. This is miraculous. Happens over and over again. Every species that has fights over territory or reproductive access has limitations and recognized gestures of appeasement or submission, such that they stop the conflict, short of lethality, except when accidents happen. We don't have this. The human animal, and because of an economy of natural selection, the human animal is utterly lacking in innate weapons. Therefore, reasons natural selection, if it could reason this in voice, it would say, we don't need recognized gestures of appeasement or submission. We're pathetic. We can't kill. Look, we have claws. We have teeth. I mean, nothing serious, right? So we don't need such gestures. Well, wrong, because we can evolve deadlier weapons than the animal kingdom can muster, and so we do need them even more. But natural selection is economized in our case, because we don't need them in nature. So we have to evolve basically some kind of a substitute, surrogate, gesture. So we have white flags, red crosses, buried hatchets. Yes, these are mere conventions of cultural evolution. They have no purchase in biology. During World War I, people wearing the Red Cross were not fired upon. It was considered, it was considered heinous to shoot at medical people, right? Nowadays, they're the first targets. Now, if you're a sniper, you want to kill them first. Why? Demoralize the troops. They know if they get wounded, there's no first aid. Makes them less inclined to fight. Hospital tents with red crosses were never bombed by convention in World War I. Now, target of choice. First thing you take out is the hospital tent. Field hospitals taken out, the soldiers have less courage because they're not going to be able to get first aid. And so this is all convention. There's no biology here. It's all convention. It depends only on convention. It's very weak. So humans murder not because we are innately murderous, but because we have no biologically hardwired recognized gestures of submission. And moreover, because technological hygiene enables killing at a distance, both for food and for warfare. When you go shopping and you get hamburger ground up in a styrofoam tray covered with plastic, you're not thinking about the abattoir. It's technological hygiene, yes? You're looking at dinner. If we took children to the abattoirs, they might be less inclined to eat hamburger. We could close McDonald's down in a week if we took people to the abattoir, I think. And we should. We won't, but we could. All right? The organized group violence of ants, rats, and chimpanzees are merely precursors to human wars and are regulated by biological constraints. Human wars are unregulated by biology and only partially regulated by culture. This is part of the problem, all right? And this is an economy of natural selection. Then, as if we didn't have enough problems, we have the commingling of sexuality with violence in the primate brain. And this is another little economy of natural selection. The primate's triune brain is a modular structure, and archicortex, that's the good old reliable limbic system of the reptile. It's been around a long time, it's tried and true. You can totally always trust a crocodile never to be trustworthy. Crocodile will always eat you if it can, okay? It's completely trustworthy in this sense. It can't be trusted. But it works well. It's not smart, but it's brilliant as a survival mechanism. You tack onto that a mesocortex, that's the lower mammalian module, and you tack onto that a neocortex, and that's the primate module. In the lower mammalian orders, rodents, vulpines, felines, canines, ursines, olfaction, and unbundling pheromones with that is the predominant sense. These animals have their noses to the ground most of the time, and their sense of smell is acute, much more so than ours. They have huge olfactory bulbs, and their senses of smell, that's the universe that they inhabit more than any other. Their olfactory bulb is correspondingly large, and for that reason mediates more ancient limbic responses to stimuli. So the physiology of fight or flight, as well as sexual congress, is in fact the same. Okay, the 12 main ingredients are identical. The latter manifests 4 additional ingredients. But in consequence, there's a marked absence among lower mammals of rape, for example. It doesn't happen among those species, and other sexual violence, because the olfactory sense detects unerringly whether the female is sexually receptive or not. Olfaction gives them this ability. However, in primates, we walk upright and we don't need our noses to the ground. We don't want our noses to the ground. So vision has become the emergent strong sense for us. And therefore, the visual cortex is correspondingly enlarged, while the olfactory bulb has shrunk through negative allometry and has largely lost contact with the limbic brain. This is catastrophic. The visual cortex has no contact with the limbic brain anatomically. And what this means is that among primates, behaviors associated with dominance have been commingled with behaviors associated with sexuality and have turned pseudosexual, since they have nothing to do with procreation or even recreation, and rather are exercises in domination or humiliation. And this design flaw in the primate brain resists correction by social engineering, without a doubt. Now you could ask another question. So we have a lot of problems, right? Is the big brain adaptive? I ask this question. Maybe you don't want to know. Well, okay. I'm not extrapolating data. I'm just showing you the data extant, all right? We have the primate brain. The higher primates are actually still doing okay. Not all of them, but most of them. They have the smallest brain. The brain weight to body weight ratio is not a strict numerical ratio. The meaningful measure is the logarithmic curve, okay? You take the logarithmic ratio of brain weight to body weight, and that becomes a meaningful measure. And basically, the higher primates are thriving, more or less, although their habitats are being encroached on. The great apes are in trouble because their habitats are now really shrinking and they're being poached. You know, kidnapped for zoos and pets and other things. So the great apes are all in trouble. The Australopithecines are long gone. They were much smarter. The Neanderthal, much smarter, gone. And the archaic Homo sapiens, smarter than the Neanderthal, gone. I've marked us, as you see, there's a bit of green, a bit of yellow, like we're thriving but endangered at the same time. Okay, so we're there. My hypothesis is that they wiped each other out. I think that the Australopithecines were too ape-like to hunt the great apes. They were more like their competitors and they were more successful. I do believe, though I merely speculate, Neanderthal probably hunted the Australopithecines to extinction because they were competitors. Archaic Homo sapiens probably hunted Neanderthals to extinction, or possibly did. And similarly, we got rid of archaic Homo sapiens. And we do a pretty good job getting rid of each other too on a given day. So this is quite possible. All I'm saying is the shape of this thing does not augur well for the adaptivity of the big brain. Yes? Long run? The bigger the brain, the shorter the longevity of the species. Okay? Now, I'm not extrapolating that. I'm merely pointing out the existing data. Food for thought, right? More specifically now, longevity. Really interesting to me, really interesting. We're most closely related to the great apes, yes? Comparative features show this, that, there's a lot of similarity in gestation. In ours, completion of growth years, we take more, okay, but the rest of it is fairly comparable, except for this one. What's our lifespan? Now, you could sell life insurance to a chimpanzee without asking it for cultural data. Okay, whether the chimp uses a twig or a leaf or a stone does not significantly enlarge its life expectancy. Okay, you could sell life insurance to it knowing 35 is about the limit, all right, whatever its tool use is. But with human beings, we've got 30 years hanging in the balance right now. And not coincidentally, the shortest life expectancies are in the most war-torn countries, obviously. The countries where there's the most conflict and the most strife. There's going to be less access, therefore, to life-sustaining resources. And so that is a cultural factor, not a biological one. By good medical science, we've pushed human life expectancy, and are still pushing it. But by warfare, we reduce it. So there's a tension there, and that's all cultural. It's got nothing to do with biology. Yes? So therefore, our inquiry into the nature of conflict leads into to an inquiry into its nurture. All right? So we're getting to chapter 6 now, and that's the nurture. Cultural evolution is Lamarckian, not Darwinian, because it relies on the inheritance and transmission of acquired characteristics. We all acquire language, we all acquire beliefs, we all acquire tools, we all acquire symbolic structures, and we transmit them. So that's fundamentally Lamarckian. Culture itself can be decomposed and analyzed as a relation between tools and symbols, or technologies and symbolic structures. Cultures can be static, meaning minimally acquisitive and largely non-innovative. And in fact, those cultures are extremely stable in the long run. The Aboriginal cultures persisted for tens of thousands of years until we overran them. And they were very static, but they were quite stable. Right? Dynamic cultures are acquisitive and innovative and must continue to be in order to sustain themselves. And they tend to be less stable. Static cultures are sustainable, but also vulnerable to subjugation by dynamic ones. Yeah? Unfortunately, but truly. While dynamic cultures are less sustainable and vulnerable to collapse or to subjugation by emergently innovative cultures. That's basically the story. Neither cultural stasis nor cultural dynamism imply either moral superiority or moral inferiority. That, for me, is completely irrelevant. Moral agency has nothing to do, in my view, with how many tools you have in your toolkit. Or with how many degrees you have in mathematics or anything else. It has to do with moral agency, which to me is completely separated from cognitive skills of the learned kind. That's what Aristotle said a long time ago, that we have intellectual virtues and moral virtues, and the two, in fact, are separate. I believe this to be the case. In general, and I argue this. In general, so-called civilized peoples, I'm sorry to tell you this, are often barbarians who have learned to export savagery as far as possible from their own front doors. Civilized people have turned savagery into a product and have learned to export it. And so they live in peace and security and safety, and they've exported their savagery. Let someone else deal with it. That's civilization. How far from our own front doors can we export savagery? Sorry to say this. I don't mean to sound so cynical. Cultural evolution is governed sui generis by synthetic selection, the cultural analog of natural selection. And synthetic selection is far more capricious than natural selection. Let me give you a couple of examples of how synthetic selection works. I wish I had more time, but there's a lot to be said. I've basically espoused in some detail a theory of cultural evolution. So I'm just going to give you a touch or a taste of synthetic selection, all right? Here's an example. you could deselect synthetically an entire technology, as was the Iron Age in Egypt. A technology of ferrous metals, though established in adjacent Palestine in the Aegean by 1000 BC, required 4 more centuries to diffuse to the Nile Valley. Why? Because till then the innovation did not satisfy a socially approved need of Egyptian culture. So they just deselected it. Right? Synthetic selection. In this case, synthetic deselection. A particular tool, even when selected, may have certain applications deselected. Okay? For example, the Dyaks of Borneo levied a fine on anyone caught chopping wood as Europeans did by notching V-shaped cuts. Yet they used the method surreptitiously, for it was an improvement on their own. Okay, so they synthetically... the Soviets synthetically deselected blue jeans and rock music, yeah? They thought it was dangerous and subversive. These became very important symbols of liberty that got smuggled in and were worn and listened to at great risk, yes? So elements can always be selected or deselected by a given pervasive ethos. So you get a feeling for it, right? It gets more interesting. For example, here's one caprice of cultural evolution. In 1920, the Pacific King Alexander of Greece died of blood poisoning due to the bite of a pet monkey. A general election led to the recall of King Constantine, who thereupon started a disastrous war on the Turks. And Winston Churchill, never wanting for witticism, Churchill observed 250,000 persons died of that monkey's bite. Okay, when in fact they died of synthetic selection. So that's how it works. Genghis Khan, when he was marauding, when the Mongol hordes were marauding across the steppes, slaughtering anyone they pleased, some villages resisted, and the Khan laughed, and he spared them because he admired their futile courage. He let them live. Other villages heaped up all their belongings outside the gates and said, please take them, and he did, and he slaughtered every one of them. Okay? This is caprice. Survival, this kind of cultural constellation of forces has nothing to do with biology. Has to do with human caprice. Synthetic selection, very risky thing. And finally, in this vein, biological evolution is not at all reversible. Yeah, humans do not evolve into apes, but cultural evolution is completely reversible, unfortunately or fortunately. Books can be banned or burned, and so-called civilized societies can degenerate into savagery and indeed into oblivion. So cultural evolution is a much more precarious business. And although the adaptiveness of the big brain is clearly questionable on biological timescales, it is remarkably adaptive on cultural timescales. The human brain is a wetware platform that initially runs whichever cultural operating system is imposed on it, for better or worse, okay? So now I'm going to define 3 kinds of cultures. And if there are any snowflakes in the room, move closer to the door now. Basically 3 kinds of cultures. Brain-like are those which project biological criteria into cultural domains. All right? So they exaggerate biology at the expense of culture. In the process, exaggerating and exacerbating flaws in the human brain. They practice strict sexual division of labor, encourage bellicosity among males and docility among females, are usually xenophobic and intolerant, and consider themselves superior. Those are hallmarks of brain-like culture. And they can be static or dynamic, by the way. We have ancient examples and we have modern examples of these. I'm not naming names today. I do in the book. Brain-like cultures can be technologically static or dynamic and can be either religious or secular with respect to their symbolic structures. Unjust by modern lights, static brain-like cultures demonstrate remarkable longevity. I'm not saying that they're necessarily morally good, but they're certainly long-lived. Brainless cultures deny biological criteria altogether and posit a monolithic set of cultural Marxist criteria as the official explanation for human conflicts and their putative resolution. Brainless cultures declare that biological facts are merely social constructs. They cannot countenance that equality of opportunity inevitably gives rise to inequality of outcome, compelling them to engage in totalitarian, at times, social engineering. Brainless cultures are also products of Western civilization in decline, and I will not give you the full Jeremiad. All right, I'll spare you. Just a little peroration, but no Jeremiah. All right, the third kind, and by the way, the role of women in warfare here is quite germane, yeah? This is quite interesting. Because a frequent assertion of brainless cultures is that since wars are the product of brain-like cultures, like violence is male, this is a common but fallacious assertion, the full emancipation of women will make the world a more peaceful place. That is the view that's been posited many, many times by many people. This wistful assertion, I claim, is falsifiable ad nauseam For example, I dug into this. I spent 3 days in the Imperial War Museum and unearthed a wealth of really interesting material. Did you know that approximately 100,000 women were active combatants in the Yugoslav Liberation War? 100,000 women, and of whom some 25,000 were killed in action and 40,000 others wounded. That's an army, a huge army of women, right? Well, violence is male. Not always. In the first phase of Israel's War of Independence, 20% of the combat troops were women of necessity. The Haganah didn't have enough men, and the women fought. In Vietnam, according to Admiral Zumwalt, the most vicious fighters were the Viet Cong women, not the men. Sorry. During the heyday of far-left urban terrorism, you remember the Baader-Meinhof and the Brigati Rossi, okay? In Germany, 10 of the 16 most wanted terrorists were women. That's not exactly underrepresentation, is it? Not quite. In 1976, the Stratton Bill here at home provided for the integration of women into formerly all-male elite military academies. You know this, in every branch of the armed services. So we now have female combat troops, female fighter pilots, female drone operators, and quite conceivably female figures poised on nuclear triggers as well, right? Stands to reason. So therefore, it seems clear that gender equality does not in and of itself make the world a more peaceful place. It can equally be used to embroil women in warfare. And many choose to be so embroiled. So cultural evolution alone is not a guarantor of peace. Cultural evolution is necessary, but not sufficient. So we need a third form of evolution. And this is the form that I'm positing as being necessary for peace. And it's called mind-like culture. Mind-like culture harmonizes nature and nurture. Mind-like cultures enable culture to transcend biology without resorting to head counts as sophomoric measures of social justice, without imposing Marxist quota systems to attain ideologically driven outcomes. Mind-like cultures also acknowledge that biology has cultural traction, e.g. biological sex differences have social consequences. But more importantly, they advocate a third form of evolution, namely psychic evolution, meaning an evolution of consciousness itself. Just as culture can transcend biology, so psyche can transcend culture. The human mind, and I teach this as often as possible, the human mind in its noblest form transcends race, class, and gender. Pure consciousness can be experienced by all human beings. Moreover, the repeated experience of pure consciousness confers immunity to inward conflict, thus disarming outward conflict. Psychic evolution is the sole feasible solution to the problem of the world, and there are a number of mind-like cultures that practice it. Right now, I'm going to try and close this. Give me 5 minutes, okay? And I will summarize chapter 7 and 8 for you. 7 is the study of conflict. Novikov recorded between 1500 BC and 1860. More than 8,000 peace treaties meant to remain in force were concluded. They endure on average 2 years. Peace treaties. Now, we need them, but they don't seem to have a very long shelf life. Theo Lenz was the father of peace studies, and in 1955 could complain that there were no peace studies anywhere in the universities. And this was remedied by 1968. 70 centers of peace research in 30 countries by 82, 350, and so forth. We have now peace groups numbering in the thousands and tens of thousands in the US. There are, at this writing, an estimated 10 million NGOs in the world. This is really mushroomed. And many of them are devoted to subjects that are allied with or coordinate with or directly involved with peace studies, peace education, peace action. So there's a huge countervailing force against all of this long misnomer that I showed you earlier. And there's a human revolution underway to try somehow to change us culturally and psychically into more peaceful animals. No one has done more than Daisaku Ikeda, a great Japanese secular Buddhist leader, and he talks about this human revolution. And remember, just like there's an asymmetry to modern conflict, 19 terrorists and 4 hijacked airplanes diverted the entire course of world history on 9/11. That's asymmetric. A great example, an unfortunate one of asymmetry. So you can also have asymmetry in the cause of peace. And Daisaku Ikeda has all his life written and taught about this process. He says a great human revolution in just a single individual will enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. And that is his humanistic and Mahayanistic philosophy of education, engages the individual as the most efficacious arbiter of both inner and outer conflicts, okay? And I believe that's a great hope. That's my kind of hope. It's a guarded optimism, but a realistic one. Now here's a scenario, okay? What can I do? You may ask yourself, so what can I do? And fair enough. You've heard all this stuff. What can I do, you may say. Imagine the following scenario. A public lecture has been given, say somewhere in the West, by an eminent scholar and peace worker who describes some of the problems we've encountered. And the audience comprises a pluralistic cross-section of peace culture. In the ensuing discussion, representatives of various wings of the movement proffer their solutions to the problem of war. A CND spokesman calls for immediate disarmament, a lawyer insists upon more international law, a feminist demands greater political power for women, an educator proposes the restructuring of academic curricula, a scientist recommends compulsory ethical training for all scientists, a clergyman proclaims that peace will come only when everyone accepts Jesus as their savior, a technocrat announces the latest social network by means of which everyone can befriend everyone everywhere instantaneously. And a Buddhist suggests that those present discover their true nature. Okay, all of this. You've heard it all before. An unadorned layman or laywoman sitting at the back of the hall says nothing. But when the recitations are finished, he stands up and asks, "But what can I do?" He's listening attentively to the others. He knows there will be no disarmament in the foreseeable future. He knows that international laws are but scraps of paper with a shelf life of 2 years on average. He knows that female politicians deliver as many broken promises and as little positive peace as males. He knows that a new university curriculum will not eradicate the illiteracy and hunger of the developing world and the pervasive cultural illiteracy at home. He knows that while Kapitsa declined to work on the Soviet A-bomb on moral grounds, others were found and can always be found who are willing to do such work. He knows that the clergyman believes that while everyone should become a Christian, some will always be more Christian than others. He knows that technologies in and of themselves will not make us more human or more peaceful. He knows that while the Buddhist may be onto something or onto nothing, as the case may be, he himself is not yet weary of wandering in samsara. Still, he wishes to do something for peace, yet he is skeptical withal. So he asks, "Well, what can I do now, after I leave this meeting?" Well, let me make a philosophical answer to you and to this man who asks, "What can I do?" First, you can refrain from asking this question, for you have already received an abundance of replies and you are not content with any of them. It is pointless to ask others what you can do, for only you know what you can do. But you need not ask yourself this question either, for you will not know what you can do until you will have tried to do something. So ask yourself this instead: what will I do? This is the profitable question, for what happens in the human world is not what could have happened, but what will have happened. Out of many things which you can or may do, you will do some and will not do others. You cannot do more than you will to do, but you will surely do less than you can if you do not will at all. The buzzword of the 1980s in UN circles and still in global circles is political will. Lack of political will and naught else prevents the resolution of armed conflicts. This lack of political will is a lack of individual beneficence multiplied many-fold. If you will have peace, ask yourself how you will practice spontaneous individual beneficence. And I will quickly give you a couple of conclusions. So you can all do something. So you can just will to do something. So can humankind end wars before war ends humankind? Can humankind end wars in any case? Those were the questions. And the response is a conditional affirmative yes. Why? If you go back over the main arguments in the book, you will find no analytic truth, no mathematical rule, no natural philosophical deduction, no etiological necessity, no biological imperative, no cultural predestination, and no systemic inevitability which dictate that war must be. Hence, we conclude that peace can be. So this is an existence theorem. It doesn't give you, unfortunately, a specific way or a specific identification of a method or a system or a route to peace, but it does identify, in some logical sense, that the possibility of world peace does exist. And so there are many pathways. Margaret Mead was a great early polemologist, scientist of war. After she got over the wool being pulled over her eyes in Samoa, she went on to become a great polemologist. And her proposals for world peace later informed the UN's MDGs and the Millennium Development Goals, which are now passé, and the new Sustainable Development Goals in their place. I discussed these in Chapter 8 rather. Globalization and refutation of the cynical charge of globaloney. I discussed this as well. Globalization and the problems of multinational alchemy and unprecedented predatory capitalism. I mean, globalization has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but it has also potentiated predatory capitalism on unprecedented scales. So again, we have this yin and yang. And some implications of the digital revolution on war and peace. These are all part of the conclusions. Final thoughts. Well, here are the final thoughts, two of them. Since it takes humans around 200,000 years to trash a planet, based on our experience, Perhaps we can improve our odds of survival by colonizing or infecting other planets. A student of mine handed in an essay with this cartoon. It was just the other day. I mean, I'd already written this. The cartoon was the Earth having a conversation with the Moon. And the Moon says, "How are you doing today, Earth?" And Earth says, "Not so good." The Moon says, "What's wrong?" And Earth says, "I just came back from the doctor. Turns out I got humans." Turns out I got humans. Right? And they said, and I think it's contagious, so you better run for it. Okay? And there's no known cure. All right. I leave you with a quote from J.B.S. Haldane, a British biologist of the early 20th century, and a wonderful philosopher besides. Writing of the myth of Daedalus, he portrayed the appearance of Nova Aquila in 1918. You know, this big explosion in the sky, night sky visible, Aquila, Nova Aquila, as witnessed by, in Haldane's words, 3 Europeans in India looking at a great new star in the Milky Way. These were apparently all of the guests at a large dance who were interested in such matters. Amongst those who were at all competent to form views as to the origins of this cosmoclastic explosion, the most popular theory attributed it to a collision between 2 stars or a star and a nebula. There seem, however, to be at least 2 possible alternatives to this hypothesis. Perhaps it was the last judgment of some inhabited world, perhaps a too successful experiment in induced radioactivity on the part of some of the dwellers there. And perhaps these 2 hypotheses are identical. And what we were watching that evening was the detonation of a world on which too many men came out to look at the stars when they should have been dancing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have some time for a few questions. If you have any questions or observations, please. I've just given you the book is much richer than this. There's a lot of flesh on those bones, believe me. But that's the bare bones. Yes.
Could you talk more about civilization and being related to exporting savagery, or what you even mean by savagery and civilization?
Yes. Well, there are historians who have analyzed human conflict and have posited 3 ages: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. These are sort of arbitrary delineations. But if you remember, firstly, the reversibility of cultural evolution, and remember, for example, Lord of the Flies is a cautionary tale. Do you know what the film director said of there was a later version, 2 versions, right? The later version of Lord of the Flies, I think from the 1970s or 80s, and the director said the only falsification he found in Golding's fable was the length of time it took. He thought they'd have trouble convincing these well-brought-up school children to play the part of savages. He said the whole transformation could have taken place over a long weekend. So he didn't have to encourage them at all. And so civilization in that sense is a kind of veneer. There's a very thin veneer over, again, it's not what lurks, it's the absence of the things that natural selection in its little economies, makeshifts and blunders, has failed to provide us with, that allows us to revert so readily. So we are civilized, but we're also capable of barbarism and capable of savagery. The Japanese troops that were ordered to execute civilians during the rape of Nanjing, and the regular Wehrmacht and the German army, who were ordered to shoot Jews in multiple places into open pits, they didn't have any trouble doing it. What they had at the beginning was an aversion to the unfamiliar. There was no instinctive reluctance to kill, and so many psychologists and ethologists and historians for a long time talks about this instinctive reluctance to kill. I have gotten rid of every instinct in the book. In chapter 5, there are no instincts whatsoever. None. There are reflexes and compound reflexes. There's no instinctive behavior at all. And there's no instinctive reluctance to kill a damn thing. What there is aversion to the unfamiliar. And once they got used to it, they just kept doing it because they became habituated to the behavior, unfortunately. And this is, so you could take people who would have considered themselves to be incredibly civilized, and they could become barbaric and savage in very, very short order under given conditions. And I believe that all of us could. If we needed to do it to survive, we might well do it too. People who end up in plane crashes in remote parts of the mountains will resort to cannibalism if they have to. I mean, there's this terrible taboo, yes, and they find it hard to live with. It's more than survivor guilt. It's I survived because I ate somebody guilt. But they do it, all right? And we would tend to otherwise condemn cannibalism as being very, I had a meeting one year with the Minister of Education of Papua New Guinea through an Australian politician friend, and they wanted somebody in there to give them ethics training, and the government of Papua New Guinea, and they wanted to take me to the highlands to work with some of the chiefs. That's true, David. And I was having lunch in, near Brisbane with this Minister of Education from PNG and an Australian politician friend, and he was a nice guy, so I was able to joke with him, and I said, okay, if you want me to go in and teach ethics to the chieftains in the New Guinea Highlands, yeah, but the first rule is don't eat the professor, okay? It's like the first commandment, don't eat the professor. He laughed, but hey, they're still eating people, and they're armed now with AK-47s, so they're very civilized now. They got Game Boys, probably, and Tupperware, to keep leftovers, right? Okay, I'm sorry, that's bad taste. Okay. David?
Seems to me that you've said a number of things which are at odds with your preference for Hobbes. That is, there are no instincts.
Yes.
There are 8.5 million people in New York City living mostly peaceably together.
Yes.
And there's one dimension that I don't hear in this, and that's what happens with mass, with large-scale societies. The French and the English, who are nominally pleasant enough within England or France, fight one another, and have for centuries.
Yes.
And we fought a civil war with people who were perceived as alien.
Yes.
Cultures seem to have the effect of convincing the members of a society that other societies are not only alien but evil.
Yes, this is Margaret Mead actually, again, in her polemological writings deals very effectively. She's not the only one, but so one and I do mention this, okay? So you're very attentive and prescient, and you understand things. But in the book, I couldn't possibly tell you everything. But there is this part of this unconscious infantilism, which is mobilized into self-transcending identification with groups, demands an out-group, demands an in-group and an out-group, and it's the out-group that's demonized for the sake of building up the sort of self-regarding prestige of the in-group. So there's always an in-group and an out-group, and the out-group is always evil, the in-group is always good, yes? So, you have these, this is brain-like culture, right? And the Nazis, right, consider themselves superiors, the master race theory. But so do the Yanomami of the Amazon rainforest, who are the fierce people, and they have a name for their non-Yanomami, they call them Naba. And it means subhuman in their language. Oh, what else is new, right? So this is a static, non-acquisitive culture that was very successful for probably a long time. But their formulation of themselves as the chosen ones and everybody else is somehow inferior.
So it comes back to the question of what can I do? Because if it turns out that as mass societies we create enemies in an attempt to give ourselves an identity with a certain pride, what can I do?
Well, make the tribe human. Make the tribe the human race. Help to make the tribe the human race.
What does that require?
Well, David, how long do we have? One thing that it requires is the following, and I don't really believe this, because if you can find a remedy to self-transcending identification, then there is no limits at the horizons of our view of who the in-group is. And there have been many, I want to say, enlightened people throughout history who have understood that the human race is the ultimate in-group.
Just this last thought.
Yeah.
Agnostics and atheists don't hang well together. But the
Right.
religious do.
Yeah.
The religious create as enemies other religions.
Yes.
So that which gives a culture identity
Yes.
is very often that which gives it hostility.
Yeah, my God suffered your God, right?
The reason for being.
But David, here's a thought, okay? And we could have a long discussion about this, maybe we should. Buddhism is not a religion. And what it postulates is, of course, the non-self and no God, and therefore it's demonstrated its compatibility with all religions, because it's not viewed as a competitor, and it's not positing itself as a competitor. It's saying, and I have had, it works really well with Jews, with Christians, and it works with Muslims too. I've had Muslim students in my Buddhist class. I have one beautiful comment from one of them who said, I'm a Muslim, and I'm going to remain a Muslim for the rest of my life, but I really liked Buddhist philosophy. It made me a better Muslim. It's making me a better person. And yes, and so Buddhism is non-judgmental in this way, not the religious fanatic type, but the philosophical type. It's saying, if you find identity in a religion, that's fine, but be your best self. And your best self is never going to be somebody who uses that religion as an excuse to demonize others, for example. okay? Because your own religion will not teach you that in its best practices. It will never teach you that. So yeah, be your best self as a Jew or a Christian or a Buddhist or an atheist, but you can live in peace with others. The French and the English are more difficult. I grant you this. Do you know when they finally dug the Channel Tunnel, do you know what they had to do? This was not a diplomatic negotiation. It was an engineering negotiation. They had to meet exactly halfway or it could not be done. Okay, they would not permit one team to stray 1 millimeter closer to the other, or the whole deal was off. So they had to laser point themselves to meet precisely in the middle of the English Channel, or the deal was off. Okay, and they did. They got it. You know, they used lasers, GPS.
Did too much work,
This was. This was because they're very. And so what David is, I think, partly what you're saying is that not all cultural programs are compatible. Not all cultural operating systems are inherently compatible with other cultural operating systems, and this is why the English and the French fight incessantly over anything, and why other kinds of groups will tend to come into conflict because of a fundamental incompatibility in their operating systems. So what this tells us is you can't change the whole operating system, but you can work on modifying part of the operating system to help to make it more compatible with another operating system.
What about Brexit?
What about who?
Brexit.
Brexit. David, in the back of the book, so now I'll take you to the back of the book, okay? I'm on the record, and I irritated a lot of people. I'm good at this too, apparently. But I irritated a lot of people. I predicted Brexit and I predicted Trump. And I was very unpopular in Europe on both counts. I was at large conferences during the run-up in 2016, and I'd been hiking around England and the hinterland talking to people. London and England are not the same. You know, London wanted to stay, England wanted to go. And of course Scotland wants to go from England. I mean, you know, we're from there, Catalonia from Spain. The whole thing could fall. The EU is in a very precarious position. It's all about immigration and nothing else. The British were afraid of losing their fundamental historic identity. Right? Britain, the last time Britain was conquered was 1066, and they wanted to stay that way. They have now 400 Sharia courts operating in Britain. They have some people saying openly they want to convert Buckingham Palace into a mosque. The English don't like this. It makes them uncomfortable, okay, when they hear those kind of sentiments. They're perfectly willing to absorb, as everybody in a civilized nation is, to absorb people because we're all built on this. We've all walked around the world, you know, our ancestors did, and the U.S. is built on enough to remind you. Take a look around. We're all built on this, but there's a condition attached to it, that when people come to a new homeland, traditionally they were expected to learn and adopt the language and the values and salute the flag and sing the anthem of that homeland that took them in. And yes, by the grace of God and political liberty, practice their own religion in the privacy of their homes or their places of worship. By all means, they should be free to do this, as John Stuart Mill would have argued, yes, and did. But they still have to respect the law of the land and not create institutions that subvert it. And most immigrants respected the law of the land traditionally in the 20th century. But this new catharsis has changed things a lot. And Merkel's the architect. And she is not a friend of Western civilization. She is, in fact, in favor of its demise. And she's largely succeeded. Things are at a crisis point in Europe, partly because of this. They may see more civil violence there now since World War II. And it's escalating, I'm afraid, sorry to say. So this is one example. So I don't know what you asked me about Brexit, but I foresaw it.
I only meant the cultural difference which makes them separate and insist on separation such that no individual can oppose the tendency. That's why it's your solution I'm really challenging.
Well, what's happening in Europe is an unprecedented experiment anyway, because the EU, the transcendence of a unified currency over political nationalisms has temporarily numbed national sentiments with economic prosperity. It's like an anesthetic. If the economy is good, everyone's with the program. But the economy is not good. Greece was a basket case. Billions and billions of euros ended up in Swiss banks that never reached the people who needed it. It's totally corrupt. And you have all kinds of other problems in the EU. So the anesthetic is wearing off. The economic anesthetic is wearing off. So again, you scratch the surface, and the tribalisms come back in the Balkans. The nationalisms come back in Europe. So all of those historically ancient quarrels have not been extinguished, they've been numbed. And I'm afraid the anesthetic is wearing off. So I'm not optimistic about the future of the EU either. But you may have, if it fractures into enough self-regulating nation states, we'll sort of be back to where we were pre-EU, post-Second World War, Treaty of Westphalia, which people keep saying needs to be revamped, but it seems still to be the best model we have. And maybe there will be more independent nation states and who will manage to govern themselves. That's a pious hope, okay? I think there have been historically, the trajectory is more and more nation states. Yes, at Napoleon's time there were like 14, and now there's well over 200, and that's continuing to increase. Maybe that's a good thing, David, all right? Maybe that gives people a smaller kind of totem, but a necessity, therefore, to trade and to have good relations with other totems because of their smallness. That's a hope. Okay.
You had made a call to see what we can do
Yes.
in response to organized violence. I was wondering if it's possible that we'll never get rid of organized violence.
Organized
Just
group violence?
Keep evolving,
Yeah.
like mustard gas in World War I, and then hacking nowadays.
Yes.
So, and also what you had to say with modern organized violence, and
Yes.
maybe future
Yes.
organized violence.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but if you're going to be realistic and say, look, we've never been able to get rid of it, it's just transformed itself from one shape to another, that's why I'm suggesting we get off the planet. I'm a kind of pragmatist. I'm saying, I just, in spite of all this, I kind of love humanity. What is it? I love humanity. There's people I can't stand, or however that goes. But I love humanity. I think humanity's great, and we kind of ought to survive. And maybe we're just a parasitic virus on the biospheres of planets. But in that case, we need to propagate ourselves across the galaxy. We kind of owe it to ourselves. And we're very close now. We know that there are habitable planets. Science is, good science fiction is tomorrow's science. And we now know that there are any number of habitable planets, like the Earth or Earth-like. And now what we need is a quantum leap in the technology to be able to get there in a reasonable amount of time. And that will happen. Some genius from who knows where is going to come up with some new engine that will get us there. And I've always wanted to go. I've got my hand up. I'm game. I'm still game. I've got enough air miles to get to the moon and back, but NASA won't take them. This is my problem, okay? NASA won't take my air miles. But I'm being serious with you. Maybe our best chance is, if we can't solve our problems on Earth, we can spread them around, okay? Wouldn't it be a great historical experiment? What if we sent a rocket full of Quakers to colonize a planet? And then we sent a rocket ship full of neo-Nazis to colonize a planet. A rocket ship full of postmodernists to colonize. And then let's observe over a few centuries, how do they do? Okay? How do they do? I think this would be a really interesting experiment. Okay? We had a microcosm, if I may. I will reveal. Did you know the story of what happened to the Pitcairn Islanders? So cultural reversals are themselves reversible, as in the pseudo-speciation of the Pitcairn Islanders. Okay, 9 English mutineers of the Bounty, 9 Tahitian women, and an unspecified number of male Tahitian stowaways, including husbands, right, of some of these women, landed on Pitcairn in 1790. After 1 English suicide and 1 English death by fever, the Tahitian men, presumably dispossessed of their wives, killed 6 of the remaining 7 Englishmen and wounded Alexander Smith. Later, Smith and 9 women killed all the native men. Okay? This is the history of Pitcairn Island, okay? Pretty gruesome, However, despite this sanguinary overture, a population that in 1808 stood at 35, 1 mutineer, 9 women, and 25 children variously sired, had peacefully increased by 1856 to 193. No more murders. Okay? Biologically, the resultant pseudospecies possessed, quote, a vigor and exuberance which equals, if not surpasses, either parent stock. And culturally, though well aware of their violent origins, the members of this pseudospecies have not deemed it necessary to pay homage to their ancestors by renewed bloodshed. So there's some hope, okay? Even if things don't have exactly an idyllic beginning, they can work out. They can live happily ever after. And there's one small counterexample. So that'll be a cause for optimism. Now, is this scalable? Now you're more realistic. You're talking about the French and the English and big cultures, millions. Is it scalable? That's a bigger problem. Okay? But potentially it's scalable. Luana.
I think this book is a wonderful example of how philosophy can help us understand human conflict. I'm wondering, moving beyond this book, what you think philosophy might do, philosophers might do as consultants to governments, and perhaps to the UN and so on. what can we contribute on such a large scale, do you think?
Well, we could contribute what, in my experience, we do well, and that is to facilitate dialogues on values, to facilitate dialogues on means toward ends, and making people realize that ends are not independent of the means, and so forth. To be quite candid with you, I don't think that any government is interested in talking to philosophers at this point. Until things get much worse, maybe they'll start grasping at straws one day. But at the moment, there is no government, to my knowledge, that has a philosopher in-house as a consultant. I think they're too worried about the Machiavellian aspect of things, perhaps. But of course, the ancient Chinese did a better job with Confucius. They took it more seriously. I find that actually authoritarian regime, in my own experience, and with the World Economic Forum and other such bodies, it is the authoritarian regime. Not despotically authoritarian, but Confucian, Singapore, for example. They took philosophy much more seriously. Western democratic leaders, in my experience with them, tend to be more, in some sense, egoistic. Because they were elected by a majority, some of them are worse than monarchs in their demeanor and their bearing. It's almost like God appointed them. They have the authority of the mob. And so they feel they don't need advice, they just need popularity. It's very dangerous. So I'm sorry to answer you this way, but I'm not optimistic I'm optimistic about the role of philosophy in the populist vein, in the grassroots domain, much more than with leaders. Lydia.
It's so weird how all these Hellenistic philosophers never thought of changing laws. They just were preoccupied with changing one's consciousness as if they were one by one. And they said, well, that's wonderful. This is what we can do, and this is what we're doing.
Yes.
This is one of your, for me, most important conclusions.
That's how psychic evolution was, yes.
One by
One by one.
consciousness, because there's no other possibility. And then wishing maybe, as you said, the leaders in the democratic and the liberal countries are more like sophists, I would say, with disregard for philosophy.
Yeah, but you're also an optimist, I think, Lydia, in this regard. I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you. A lot of CEOs, it turns out, not politicians, but CEOs are brilliant and overworked people, the ones I've met. It's not easy to do this. And many of them have said to me they would like to be philosophers in their next life. Because they immediately see that we have time to reflect. They don't. They have to make decisions, and their heads are on the block every quarter, and they're under constant pressure, and they have to manage huge organizations, and entropy is big time applicable to organizations. They will, if left to their own devices, Merle, you're in a big, they will just simply fall apart if no one's at the helm. So these people are enormously responsible, and they're not the politicians. Buckminster Fuller famously wrote back in the 60s, if we took all the politicians and simply made them vanish overnight, nothing would change. They would just get new politicians in the morning, another bumper crop like mushrooms, they'd spring up. But if we took away the engineers, everything would fall apart. Okay? So that's the reality. And the CEOs are very amenable to philosophy, but they're basically also not people who have time much to reflect, so they want to boil it down. Can you give me a philosophy course in 20 minutes? Like I could make 20 minutes next Tuesday. Can we do this? Well, not really. But they have more time for it than the politicians that I've met, for sure.
So apropos that, I think we're pretty much out of time, but
Yes.
we can continue informally your life.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, once again. Thank you all for coming and for bearing with me and for your engagement. I really appreciate it. And think about it. You don't have to buy the book. It costs too much. But take away some of these thoughts. And if you do get the book, feel free to contact me if you have further questions, okay? And you want to continue the dialogue, I'll be very happy to do it with you. Okay? Thank you very much. Thanks.